Hi, I'm here. Oh,
Hello.
Good morning.
hi.
Hi, Tom.
Good morning. I didn't have my headset on when I first put it on, joined, so sorry if anybody said something, but good morning to all.
Hello, this is John Latinsky. I just joined. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, we can, John.
All right. Hey, Lee, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. Hold on, I'll turn on my camera.
And we can see you too now, John. But we can no longer hear you.
I can go back off camera if you need me to save bandwidth.
No, it's fine.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, you'll be the second person speaking, so it's probably good
Okay.
that you've got things on. And were you going to cover sort of the overall iWest goals?
Yes, from DOE's perspective, I think Rajesh or George were going to talk more specifically about the project, but yeah, I'll talk a little bit about why this is important to our DOE and why we're invested in it.
Okay.
Cameras off until you over speaking, or do you want cameras on? Your preference for the.
You got real soft, Eileen. I was having trouble hearing you.
I wanted to know if you wanted our cameras on or off until we speak. Do you want us off camera until we speak?
I think for bandwidth purposes, probably for the most part.
Okay, sounds good.
If things seem to be functioning, it doesn't matter a whole lot.
Okay.
Okay, we're at 9 o'clock, and we'll go ahead and I'm just quickly paging through and seeing if we've got most of the people we expect on board, and it looks like we do. So we'll go ahead and get started here. I'm Lee Spangler, co-PI with Julia Haggerty on the Montana portion of the Intermountain West Energy Sustainability and Transitions Project funded by DOE. And the goal of this project is to look at pathways to carbon neutrality in a 6-state Intermountain West region and how to accomplish that in an equitable fashion addressing stakeholders' interests and needs. Our approach to this will be to hold this initial workshop that has expert input and then have a group of stakeholder workshops to get broader input into this process. So this is the first of a series of workshops, and we will use this to help guide how we set up the subsequent workshops. My slides are not advancing. There we go. Before we begin, I wanted to point out a few things. One, this workshop is being recorded. If you're having any trouble with WebEx or need any assistance, you can call or email Paige Tollison or Kelly Romer, and their contact information is there and on the agenda that we distributed. This shows the opening agenda. And then I wanted to make a few remarks. If you're a speaker and have your microphone on, please make sure your cell phone is off. Please mute if you're not one of the speakers, because we can get a lot of feedback and background noise with this number of participants. This pathway to carbon neutrality, this project is specifically looking at the intersection of a carbon economy, biofuels economy, and a hydrogen economy. But because Montana is an energy exporter, we will be looking a little bit more broadly than that on a few topics. The other thing I wanted to mention is, in a lot of our transitions, we'll have slides of Montana. We did that for 3 reasons. One, we thought it would be fun. Second reason is this is supposed to be place-based solutions, and in a virtual world, tying us back to the place through these photos might be a little bit helpful. And the last is, if we look at stakeholders in Montana, and I suspect this is true of other Intermountain West states, a lot of people in this state feel very connected to the land. And so this reminds us of that as well. And then finally, before I introduce John Latinsky from DOE, I do want to have some thank yous here. I want to thank you, DOE, for funding this. Los Alamos National Lab, the lead organization, for bringing us in as a subcontractor. The people who helped organize this, Julia Haggerty, the co-PI, Mark Haggerty, Paige Tollison, who's providing administrative support. And because of the timing of this and the short timeline, we actually had less administrative support than we would normally have done. And a graduate student, Kelly Romer, really stepped up and did a lot to put this together, more than we would normally ask of a student. And I really appreciate that and wanted to make sure she got thanked. Last thing I want to mention is, if you look at some of the goals of this project, it's technology development, workforce development, and stakeholder engagement. And so, being an academic university, we look at Carnegie classification for these things in the appropriate categories. Technology development is like very high research activity, workforce development, high undergraduate enrollment profile, stakeholder engagement, community engagement. And if you plug these into Carnegie classification tool that's online, one university pops up, and that's Montana State University. So that's my ad for our institution. Now I'd like to introduce John Latinsky from the Department of Energy for some opening remarks. He currently serves as the Deputy Director for the Advanced Fossil Technology Systems in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. He previously served as the Program Manager for Carbon Capture at the Department of Energy, which is how I got to know him, and the Technology Manager for Carbon Sequestration at the National Energy Technology Laboratory. He also served as the team lead on environmental compliance and assessment in the U.S. Army, and has over 25 years of experience working on environmental compliance and technology development for the energy industry and the Department of Defense. He got his BS in civil engineering from Virginia Polytech and his master's from Johns Hopkins in environmental engineering and science, and he's here to give us DOE's perspective on this project. John?
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Julia. I really appreciate the opportunity just to say a few words. And I'm really encouraged by this project. My career has been spent on a lot of difficult issues. One was carbon sequestration, standing up regional partnerships. Before that, with the Army, was working on a lot of deployment-related issues and environmental impacts to deployed forces, but even some of the more challenging issues that we had at home. And the one thing that I always recognized was that stakeholder engagement was always the fundamental to the success of the deployment of any big project or activity that we were doing, because there was always stakeholder concerns. And if you did that early, you usually avoided a lot of issues. And so I am very excited that this project got off the ground. We have a couple of regional activities, and this is one. We also have one in the Appalachian region. We're looking at regions that are really going to go under a significant energy transition in their regions, and ones that are going to need support in planning. And so we're just helping to facilitate that discussion. You're really doing the work. All the other universities in Los Alamos are really the ones out on the front, and they should be, with the communities that are going to be, considering how they're going to adapt to the changing world as we start decarbonizing the economy. As you've seen, some of the commitments that are coming out of the administration on Earth Day, the president announced, a national commitment to decarbonize the economy by 50 to 52%. That's only a decade away. That's a significant, goal to meet. If we look a little bit beyond that, in 2035, they're looking to decarbonize the entire electricity sector. And then by 2050, getting to net zero emissions. One thing is, decarbonization, whatever route that is, it's renewable energy, it's CCS, it's, displacement of fossil fuels with hydrogen, or using biomass to displace some of those energy, is all going to play a role. And they're going to play a role at a pace that no one has built these systems at previously. If you look at some of the studies from Princeton or others that are coming out and talking about the opportunity to deploy CCS alone, that's my area of expertise. So I'll just talk about it. Is we're looking at building a CCS infrastructure, significantly larger than the existing enhanced oil and gas recovery operation, and that is just going to be dedicated for storage. Those are just projections, but again, modelers can do great things. My issue with models is they're always wrong. Really, what it takes is for people to, consider stakeholders' concerns when they do those models. I was looking at one of the models the other day, and they had this great map of the entire United States and the deployment through 2050 of what they think, CCS is going to deploy. And again, this meeting is not all about CCS, but the Intermountain West was completely devoid of any infrastructure development. I'm not saying that's not how it's going to happen, but given the opportunities there, the storage and others, there's probably going to be a little bit more deployment than what we think. But again, that doesn't mean it needs to be. It's just we need to start having the discussions first about what the regions are interested in. This study is broader than just CCS. It really is, as Lee said, looking at hydrogen, looking at CCS, looking at biomass, how those are all going to be interconnected as, a region kind of transitions itself from a carbonized economy to a decarbonized economy. And that's extremely important to us to understand that. We are not the only office that's funding this. The Bioenergy Technology Office is funding it. There's some other activities through the EERE Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technology Office that might be funding some other national labs in the region. We just want to make sure it's all well coordinated, so that, we're not just trying to think that there's one silver bullet. There really is a give and take between these different technology routes, as they start to decarbonize the economy. So again, I just want to thank you all for being part of this. I know a lot of these meetings are going on throughout all of the states. I just wanted to give you a perspective of why this is so important to DOE. As we look to build this infrastructure, I think these early investments and these early discussions are going to bring together the teams that are going to help shape future infrastructure investments, whether that's through an infrastructure bill or just private industry. So again, thank you, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to say a few words.
Okay, thank you very much, John. We're a couple minutes ahead of schedule. Rajesh, I don't know if you had any really brief remarks you wanted to make. It wasn't on the schedule, but perhaps you wanted to follow on something John had said.
Well, I mean, John, and you pretty much described overall objectives for this project and also what we're trying to get out of this workshop. In addition to that, I don't have anything else to add other than thank you all for participating and contributing to this venture we're on. And thank you, Lee, Julia, and Kelly for organizing the workshop.
Thank you. Okay, I'll go ahead and introduce our plenary speakers. Jeremy Hargreaves from Evolved Energy Research is an expert in energy systems analysis, focusing on least cost electricity system planning and distributed energy resource evaluation. Jeremy has a PhD focused on energy systems optimization and an MS in environmental management and economics from Johns Hopkins. He also holds a master's degree in chemical engineering from Imperial College London. And then Eileen Quigley from Clean Energy Transition Institute is the founding executive director of that institute, which aims to accelerate an equitable energy transition in the Northwest. Eileen led the team that produced the Washington State 2021 Energy Strategy, and she has a Master's of Science in Journalism from Columbia University and a Bachelor's of Arts in Literature from Yale University. I will just briefly remark that Evolved Energy Research has been doing some modeling of energy transitions in the Pacific Northwest, and because Montana is an energy exporter to that region, it will affect Montana's transition, and so some of that information will be presented in their presentation. I know we're a minute or two early, but if we could go ahead and have you turn on your slide sharing and make sure that's all functioning, that would be great. Okay. It looks like everything's working right. I think even though we're a minute or two early, we can go ahead and get started. Jeremy?
Great. Thanks, Lee. I think Eileen is going to introduce the presentation here briefly. So Eileen, you want to go ahead?
Yes, certainly. I think if you just advance to the slide, I think we have a slide on the agenda. Yes, and then just the first two slides from me, Jeremy, and then we'll turn it over to you. So first of all, thank you so very much for this opportunity. We have been incredibly impressed with how quickly you all have put this together. The timeline was really short and the program is just excellent, and we're honored to be included. I run the clean energy transition, as we said, and we work to accelerate an equitable transition, clean energy transition in the Northwest. We develop analytics and research to help key stakeholders and policymakers debate the trade-offs around the deep decarbonization in the Northwest. And we work in the 4 states in the Northwest: Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. I've been working in this area for about 13 years and previously had run a program called the New Energy Cities Program at Climate Solutions, which worked with small and medium-sized communities throughout the 4 states as well. And so most of my time has been spent on the ground working with stakeholders. I wanted to agree with what John just said about the criticality of working with people in their space, understanding precisely what is available and possible on the ground, but allowing the folks who know their communities to drive the solutions. And so while we do modeling, and Jeremy's going to spend the next few minutes or 40 minutes or so talking about the modeling we've done, we place a huge value also on the importance of making that modeling real in the context and with the input of the local communities. So we released our deep decarbonization pathway study in June of 2019 and have been updating it along the way, have done additional modeling for the state of Washington as well as for the state of Oregon. We are now in the process with Evolved Energy this fall, right now in this next 3 to 4 week period, of updating that Northwest Deep Decarbonization Pathway Study. So one of the things that I'm hoping will come out of our engagement here is ongoing engagement with folks at MSU, but also others who may be listening who are interested in helping us help Montana determine what the best pathways are for decarbonization future. So we're going to, I've already done the first thing, transition institute, and I'm going to turn this over to Jeremy. So we spend most of the time listening to his presentation and then taking Q&A. He's going to walk through some of the results from our Washington State energy work and the Oregon Clean Energy Pathway Study, which was released in July. And he's also going to talk about the work we did last year about looking at the Northwest Decarbonization Pathway Study from Montana, impacts on Montana. And he's going to work throughout the presentation context for Montana, even when talking about Washington and Oregon. And that's it. Except to thank you very much for this opportunity.
Great, thanks very much, Eileen. So the reason why I wanted to start off with Washington and Oregon here is because these are more recent studies than the ones that we looked at specifically for Montana, and that the regional action has such a large impact on Montana. I think it's useful to think about what are other states doing, what is the region doing, and how is that setting up the West in terms of where energy is flowing, where fuels are being produced, etc. And what kind of opportunities that gives us when thinking about Montana and development of Montana resources. So I'll skip over these introduction slides here. One thing to mention is that in Lee's introduction, he was talking about the Princeton study, Net Zero America, that was evolved modeling behind that. And in the Northwest, we've been doing a lot of different work, both with Washington, with Oregon, last year with Montana, and in the other states in the West as well. So we're pretty familiar with the action that's happening across all of the various different Western states. So decarbonizing the Northwest, it does have this West-wide context, because as we move to a more decarbonized system, then we're moving to potentially a more integrated system, both in electricity, but also integration with fuels as well. So where does energy come from, whether that energy is electricity, whether it's diesel, jet fuel, petroleum products. These are all questions when thinking about decarbonizing our economy. How is that geographic element impacting things? So takeaways from other decarbonization studies indicate that there are opportunities for Montana. We have increased demand for clean energy resources across the West, and Montana has a really valuable high capacity factor wind resource. And so that is being drawn upon in a lot of the different decarbonization studies that are happening in the Northwest, in California, in the Southwest. And that's, you know, in large part because of cost. The other part there is that it's complementary with the Southwest solar resource as well. So if you think about where loads are in the West, a lot of those loads are on the coast. And as you go down into California, those loads are matched with a very diurnal solar resource, an excellent solar resource, but you know, timing wise, that's in the middle of the day. And complementary to that is wind that's being produced in Montana, in Wyoming, and potentially offshore wind resources as well. And so a diverse portfolio is one way to lower costs to decarbonize the West, and Montana wind is a key part of that. So modeling characteristics for evaluating clean energy pathways, these are characteristics to all of the studies that we've done across the West. We're exploring pathways to achieve electricity and emissions targets in transitioning all sectors of the economy. So that's not just electricity, but thinking about how are we decarbonizing all of the various types of fuel use in residential, commercial, industrial sectors of the economy. And then we're determining optimal resource investment constrained by various different kinds of scenarios. And in the introduction, we talked about the value of stakeholder processes and making sure that we have the interests of different states represented in producing solutions going forward. In large part, we're doing that through scenarios in the work that we're doing, where in Washington, in Oregon, these are stakeholder-driven processes where we're trying to represent the interests in various different scenarios and represent the economic counterpoint of various types of policy decisions that could be made. Decarbonizing energy supply. So once we know how much energy we're using on the demand side of various different types, then we're thinking about what are the least cost investments in electricity resources, pipeline gas, liquid fuels. And the assumptions that we're making about the costs of these various elements are pretty conservative because we're basing those on existing technologies and cost projections from public sources. And then the last part of this is that we are looking at the integration of electricity and fuel systems beyond state borders, so capturing regional opportunities and challenges associated with building out this very different system from where we are today. So thinking first about the Washington State Energy Strategy, I'm going to summarize some of the results, mainly in terms of what this means for Montana. I think most people will be familiar with the Washington electricity system at the moment as being a net exporter in the region. There's a lot of hydro, and that hydro is being exported south. As we transition to a cleaner economy in the future, we're growing a lot of the electric loads. A lot of the assumptions that we find to be least cost across the analyses in the West is that transitioning to a larger electricity sector because of electrification of transportation, electrification of various types of appliance. That means that we have to produce more electricity from these clean sources. And Washington's clean energy resources are not as valuable as some others in the region. You know, Washington doesn't have good onshore wind. The Montana resource is better than what Washington has. And so we transition from this net exporter state to a net importer, significant net importer, by the time we get out to even 2030, but particularly by 2040 and 2050. The other significant element of Washington's targets are that they are probably the most aggressive in the country in terms of what kind of action they need to take to meet their targets. And so by 2030, to meet their emissions targets, Washington already has to have developed some kind of clean fuels economy. And the question is, where are the biofuels coming from? Where is the electricity coming from to produce those clean fuels? And that also impacts Montana as well. So thinking first about what is this difficult challenge that Washington has set themselves. On the left-hand side there, we show 2018 emissions by sector of the economy. So electricity, transportation, RCI, and then industrial CO2 at the bottom. And then the targets 2020 through 2050, they are marked with the red dots. So starting at 76 million metric tons, we need to drop that to 40 million metric tons by 2030. And so that's a 53% reduction over 2018 energy and industry CO2 emissions. And looking back at 2018, we already have a very clean electricity sector in Washington because of the large hydro resource. And so that's accounting for about 16 million metric tons in 2018. And we need to drop the emissions significantly more than what we could do if we got rid of all of those electricity emissions. So that means we need to start taking action in other parts of the economy as early as 2030 to be able to cut those emissions in half in 10 years' time. And this is relatively unusual if we think about all of the different states across the US that have set themselves targets. For the most part, they can meet those targets in 2030 in the near term by targeting the electricity sector, because they have coal in the portfolio, and taking the coal away is getting them significantly towards those 2030 targets. Washington is in this very unique position, and so movement in the next 10 years needs to be very rapid to be able to meet this near-term target. And that means importing more energy. So where do the imports come from when we look at least cost investments across the West to meet targets for emissions reductions? So in 2030, you can see that Washington is already becoming a net importer. The pie charts on the left are showing where electricity is coming from. And the green is Washington resources, the other colors are other different states. By 2050, about 43% of electricity is coming from other states and being imported into Washington. You can see that Montana makes up a large fraction of that, Wyoming as well. So Montana, Wyoming wind, both of these resources are excellent, and depending on the transmission constraints, there may be more from one, less from the other. But you can see on the right-hand side there what constitutes these imports. And by 2040, 2050, the wind from Montana and Wyoming is in large part the electricity that's being imported into the state. And that is not isolated just to Washington. We have these thirsty loads on the coast, including California's, which is the largest load in the West. We can see a similar thing happening there as well, where imports from more easterly wind resources are extremely valuable and are driving investment in those regions and driving investment in new transmission as well. And so from an opportunity perspective, the question is, what is the feasibility of building out a large wind resource, both in terms of the overall potential of doing so, and then secondly, the rate at which that could happen. And then two, what is the potential of building out transmission to be able to facilitate these kind of imports and exports? And is it desirable to do so in terms of the types of impacts those developments would have? California has plans to build out HVDC lines to be able to access some of this wind resource. In our studies, in this Washington study and in the Oregon study, we are allowing the existing corridors to be expanded by up to 6 gigawatts. And it's economic under the costs that we're assuming for that transmission to do so in pretty significant fashion. So looking at regional capacity, this illustrates the point that I was making earlier about the complementary nature of Southwest solar Southwest solar, and then the wind in the interior of the West. So wind resources in Montana, Wyoming built out significantly. The solar resource in yellow there is constituting most of the resource built in the Southwest. And then in the coastal Northwest, then we have hydro still making up quite a significant portion of the energy. And then offshore wind is is starting to feature there as well in 2040, 2050, and you can see that in Oregon, offshore wind is making up quite a large component of renewable resources by that point. Clean fuels is the other component to think about when thinking about Washington's influence on Montana. And here, what I'm showing on the right-hand side is what makes up the various sort of major fuel components in the economy. We have pipeline gas, liquid fuels, and hydrogen. And liquid fuels is that middle column there. That's the one to focus on here, because in order to be able to meet those emission goals in Washington, we need to be producing clean fuels by the time we get to 2030 to get under that target. And the clean fuels shown here in blue are synthetic fuels. So they're created from hydrogen from electrolysis using the electricity system. And then the green are biofuels. So coming from biomass resources that are either located in Washington or elsewhere to create clean fuel alternatives for the fuels that we use in the various sectors of the economy. And the question for Montana here, for a state like Washington and for other states that are not going to move this quickly on displacing fuels in the economy, but will move to clean fuels in the future to power those parts of the economy that cannot be electrified and we have to decarbonize in some way, is where does clean fuel come from? And thinking about energy imports, we typically think about transmission lines in transmitting energy from one place to another. But underlying our whole economy, we have this huge pipeline network of natural gas flowing across the United States. We have liquid fuels transported all over the United States in the form of petroleum, diesel. And we now start to see opportunities for states that can produce alternatives to those fuels and transport them that currently we don't really have, because fuels are coming from fossil resources, Henry Hub, etc. If you're a state that has low cost renewables or large amounts of biomass, then the opportunity to create clean fuels and export them to other places is going to grow larger and larger as our emissions caps across all of the states in the US become tighter. And so potentially this is an opportunity for Montana as well. And if you think about the trade-offs with transmission, right now we are allowing in our studies 6 gigawatt expansion of transmission. But when you think about the feasibility of transmission expansion, we've had a couple of lines in the last 10 years across the West of any significance being built. And the planning phase of getting from conception to steel in the ground is extremely long. So can we expand the transmission to the extent that we identify as being part of a least cost solution? Maybe not. But it's not the only pathway to transmit clean energy to other places. We can also send clean fuels through pipelines, through rail, through road transportation, etc. And that's another way of exporting energy out of the state to other places. Just looking at this from a national perspective, national fuels industry in 2050, hydrogen and carbon. So on the left-hand side there, we have hydrogen supply. On the top, we have hydrogen demand on the bottom. And hydrogen demand is a lot of power to liquids, so producing those liquid fuels. We have end-use demand as well. There are assumptions here about some of the long-distance heavy-duty vehicle fleet transitioning to hydrogen. And then where is that hydrogen coming from? Electrolysis is the main component of that. There's some gas reformation as well happening. In order to be able to produce those liquid fuels, we need to combine the hydrogen with carbon. And so on the right-hand side there, you see US carbon supply and demand. On the bottom, we have carbon demand. So Power to liquids, again, is making up the bulk of that. We have some sequestration happening. One thing to note here on the demand side is that this Washington study is using 2019 costs for various different technologies. What we would see now with our latest studies is some more sequestration happening than what we had in this study. But still significant amounts of power to liquids happening to decarbonize those hard to decarbonize or hard to electrify parts of the economy, like aviation, like shipping, rail, and potentially some of the heavy duty vehicle fleet. Then on the top there, we have carbon supply. So where is it coming from? Industrial carbon capture is in gray. We have a little bit of direct air capture happening. And then from biofuel sources as well, that's a significant component of where our carbon is coming from. Where our fuels are being produced is shown here. So the size of the production is the size of the pie, and then the type of production is the fraction of the pie. And looking at Montana, you can see that Montana's fuels production is a lot larger than what we see in Washington, what we see in Oregon, and it's outsized production for the size of the Montana economy. And so all of that electrolysis that's happening, that's taking advantage of the lower cost, high capacity factor wind resource that's present in Montana, and then fuels are being exported to other places. So just thinking about key findings from the Washington State Decarbonization modeling, the state energy strategy, the challenge of decarbonization for Washington is a question of pace of action in the near term. So what can we do in 10 years to foster a clean fuels economy? Where does the energy come from for that? And then scale in the long term. So this is a question, or this is a finding really for all states. There's such a vast transition required to get to a electricity sector that's maybe 80 to 100% larger than what we see today, and to a clean fuels economy that decarbonizes what's remaining unelectrified in the economy. We have that 2030 challenge where currently we're seeing about 16 million metric tons of CO2 emitted from electricity, but we need to reduce our emissions by 44.8 million metric tons to reach that 2030 goal. And so it needs to come from other types of action other than just decarbonizing electricity. Even with greenhouse gas neutral electricity, the follow-on is here that our emissions target is challenging. And so what can we do transitioning that fuels economy? And we need regional energy solutions to do that. So significant imports of clean energy in the form of electricity and fuels. And as we saw, Montana is one of the main places, just from a cost perspective, where that energy is drawn from. One thing to note here is that when we're doing these studies, they're physical studies of what is the potential in various different locations. What are hourly load shapes? How does that load evolve over time? What is the transmission potential? What is the expansion potential of that transmission? So there are a lot of on-the-ground factors on what can be done to expand transmission, to build renewables, what are local policies that could be put in place that are not factored in here. And this is giving us an idea of, if we had, relatively free rein to invest in resources in different locations, this is what we would do. But what we have not done is looked at a Montana-specific stakeholder process, taking into account the various interests of different groups and the types of policy or scenarios that we might investigate to see what is the value of taking different approaches to decarbonizing the economy. So going on to the Oregon Clean Energy Pathways Study, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly here, but this is another one where it's another state that has implications on what is happening in Montana. Oregon is probably less impactful because it's a smaller economy, but it's a different type of example of decarbonization than Washington, where Oregon does start from a larger representation of coal in the electricity portfolio. And so 2030 is not very challenging, or not as challenging as Washington to decarbonize, because coal can be removed from the portfolio. And so in that respect, it's somewhat similar to Montana in that there is a lot of coal represented currently in the electricity portfolio. It is also becoming a net exporter of wind energy by the time we get out to 2050, because developing that offshore wind resource is valuable to the West. So the goals of this project were to look at various questions associated with decarbonizing Oregon's economy to inform policymaking. And there's a few questions laid out here where through stakeholder work, we identified these as issues that were pertinent to policymaking in the state. Oregon's emissions targets look like this, where we're starting from the emissions in 2019 shown there on the left-hand side, and then the emissions targets are shown in the red there. But we're going to a target that's 45% below 1990 levels by 2035. And so whereas Washington's target was 2030, Oregon's is 2035, plus we have that coal in the electricity portfolio, there's just a little bit more breathing room there. By having a target that is further out into the future, we can avoid having to do clean fuels to decarbonize the portfolio, because we have the time to be able to electrify some of those fuel consuming resources. You know, Washington in 10 years, given the lifetimes of vehicle stocks, there isn't a lot of time to roll over vehicles from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. But if we have 15 years, then we can go further down that road of electrification. We can reduce our loads further that need to be served by fuels, so that we don't have to get into that early clean fuels transition. And this is somewhat shown here, where we're looking at final energy demand in the state. We're assuming this quite aggressive policy of electrification of various different types of end uses. So on the left-hand side there is the reference case, where we have still some growth over time in final energy demand, just because of growth in population, growth of industrial activity. But the core decarbonization case in the middle, we see a 38% reduction in total final energy demand. And in large part, that's because we're moving to electrified end uses that have much greater efficiencies than what we had before. Transportation is a key component of that, where we're moving from ICE vehicles that have a efficiency of 30-something% to electric vehicles that have efficiencies of 80-something%. And so that gives us this big reduction in energy demand over time. But at the same time, we're moving to a much larger electricity sector, which is shown in the light blue there. So overall, less energy, but a lot more energy required from electricity. And this is a trend that we are, in this study, we're modeling all of the states around as well, including Montana. And we're assuming that Montana is going through the same transition, going to a decarbonized future when thinking about Oregon or thinking about Washington. So this is a similar trend to what we've modeled in Montana in these studies. Generation and load here. So generation on the top, terawatt hours, load on the bottom. You can see in load there, focusing just on the bottom, we have the bulk load in gray. So that is what we've just projected is needed on that last slide. But at the same time, we have exports going out of state, which is shown in the red there. And then we have growth of our electrolysis loads as well. So by the time we get to 2050, we have some electrolysis, which is the light blue area there, occurring to generate hydrogen for clean fuels production. Then on the top there, generation, how are we meeting those loads? Well, we have the existing hydro resource on the bottom, and that doesn't really change over time. But then we have some growth in solar, a little bit of growth in onshore wind, but the bulk of the growth in resources in Oregon comes from that offshore wind, which is the darker teal color there. And prior to that, Oregon is actually importing a lot of clean energy from places like Montana to be able to meet their clean electricity needs. So hydrogen supply and demand, I think we can probably skip this because we've gone through this for Washington, but it just shows this spike up of electrolysis over time to be able to produce our clean fuels. And then balancing the system. This is a key piece of how the Northwest differs from the Southwest of the US, because we have in the Northwest a predominantly wind system with some solar available, but in the Southwest we are really a solar dominant system. So if we look at Western states on the right hand side there, first of all, so this is the whole West, you can see a very large solar component to overall production over a 24-hour period. And I've picked here a December day and a July day. And the reason for that is because in Oregon on this particular December day, we have very little renewable production on one day and a lot of renewable production on the other day. But in the West as a whole, you can see this pattern of solar production in the middle of the day, and then an uptick in storage, which is shown on in the dark blue on the load row on the bottom of that chart, and an uptick in electrolysis as well. So our flexible resources, storage and electrolysis, are kicking on to be able to take advantage of all of that solar energy production. And then when we get into the shoulder period where that solar drops off, then we start to discharge the storage, and we also turn off all of our electrolysis. So we've used the electrolysis loads to help balance the system. And that is really important for reducing our costs by the time we get out to 2040, 2050. Because otherwise, if we didn't have this electrolysis to be able to balance both multi-day and seasonal energy differences, then we would have to be building some other kind of resource like significant amounts of storage. And that would be really expensive compared to using the electrolysis to shift energy around in the day, in the month, and in the year. You can think of electrolysis as just another form of energy storage. Instead of discharging it back to the grid, you're discharging it to vehicles instead in the form of clean fuels. And we can produce those clean fuels at any time of the year when we have large amounts of renewables available, but we don't have to consume those fuels until we need them. So we can produce them all in the summer and then consume them in the winter, and that helps us balance a system that is going to become more seasonal over time. So transmission expansion, 2020 on the top, 2050 on the bottom. In the case of Oregon, we modeled an 80 by 50 target and a 100 by 50 target. And in both cases, you can see that we have significant strengthening of the transmission grid across the West. And from Montana in particular, we have transmission expansion coming through into Washington, and we have transmission expansion coming into Idaho as well. So facilitating the greater exports going out of Montana into the rest of the West, that valuable wind resource, we have growth of transmission to be able to do that. So key takeaways here, it's relatively straightforward for Oregon compared to what we saw in Washington to be able to achieve their near-term targets, just from removing coal from the portfolio. Oregon is positioned between two much larger loads. So like Montana, they are very impacted by what is happening elsewhere. So Washington's growth in clean energy demand, California's growth in clean energy demand, it's influencing both the investments in resources, because Oregon is becoming this large exporter of power with the offshore wind resource, and also in terms of growth of transmission. So transmission through Oregon is kind of a hub where power is flowing through and down into California. And a lot of that is coming through from Montana into Washington and down, or from Montana into Idaho, across and down into California. So just thinking about what this means for Montana in particular, we're facilitating imports and exports of clean energy, taking advantage of geographic and resource diversity. And that means balancing of complementary resource shapes, using that Montana wind, that Wyoming wind. Oregon exports clean energy to California from offshore wind. It imports from California in the Southwest solar resource. So just using the resources of the West to get complementary production hour to hour and a more balanced portfolio. And this east to west movement of energy from onshore wind resources in Wyoming and Montana. I have some key actions here, 2020, 2030, and 2040. I think I'm going to just skip over these because it's probably most interesting to get into the Montana findings from our Northwest EDP. And I'm showing these with the caveat that this is an older study now, and it also was never designed specifically for a Montana policy analysis. We were looking overall at the Northwest. And so results here are based on the assumptions that we have for the transition of the Montana demand side, and the assumptions on the supply side about what we allowed to do in terms of transmission expansion, the resource potentials, etc. And so if we were thinking about Montana in particular, we would want to do a more detailed study where we factor in various stakeholder input into what are the key concerns and the types of investigation that will best inform policy making. But these give a flavor of the types of assumption and result that we saw in 2018 using in the Northwest Deep Decarbonization Pathway Study. So released in June 2019, we focused on the 4 Northwestern states. And we've pulled the specific Montana results here. So starting from our 2017 emissions, we can see what constitutes that. In 2017, electric power makes up about 50% of that, and then transportation 26%. So you can see already that this is a very different starting place from Washington, and presents some opportunities for relatively low cost transition to emissions reductions compared to what Washington has to do to get to their 2030 targets. What we assumed in this 2018 study was that we were going to go to an 80% emissions reduction by 2050. And that's probably a little bit out of date now, because most states, or many states, are considering 100%, including California, including Washington. But the 80% emissions reduction was what we assumed for the Northwest and all states in the region in this study. And that translated into an 86% reduction for energy-related emissions, because we assumed that it would be harder to get emissions reductions in non-CO2 sources, for example, agriculture. And so it would be, we overcompensated on the energy side to be able to allow for a little less emission reduction on the non-CO2 side. Looking at the Montana energy demand, so this is a similar trend to what we saw for Oregon. And you can see electricity growth over time, where we're seeing 80% growth or 70% growth in electricity consumption, at the same time as our other fuel uses decrease because we're moving to a more electrified economy. And the advantage of that is that we are reducing overall our final energy demand, and so we just need less total megawatt hours or tera-BTUs of energy to be able to serve our clean economy in 2050 than if we were to remain a predominantly fuels consuming economy. What that translates to on the electricity side is this increase in transportation electricity demand from electric vehicles. There's some increase in buildings, some increase in productive sector as well, because of electrification of appliances. And to get there, what we're assuming basically is that all passenger vehicles on the road are electric by 2050. And from a policy perspective, that puts us to all sales of electric vehicles being electric by about 2035 in order to have the stocks roll over to get to this 100% electric passenger vehicle stock by 2050. And that's shown here. So on the top here, I have vehicles on the road, light duty vehicles, medium duty vehicles, heavy duty vehicles. You can see the transition happening in this study in each one of those categories. And this is something that we probably would be nowadays making a more aggressive assumption on the medium duty vehicle and heavy duty vehicle side, transitioning to more electric or some component of hydrogen usage as well in those categories. Then in building electrification, you can see here example for space heating, for water heating, a transition away from gas towards electric, and then the resulting final energy demand from doing so on the bottom there, getting greater efficiencies from heat pump usage versus existing appliances. Energy demand, transmission electric load here, you can see the growth in the fixed loads from those electrification measures, and that's shown in the gray. So starting from where we are in 2020, moving to 2050, you can see that 70% increase in electric demand over time. On top of that, we have some additional demands from new types of industrial flexible load. So the predominant form of that is electrolysis, and that's shown in the light blue there. So that electrolysis load is being used to produce hydrogen and subsequent synthetic fuels for decarbonizing the economy. One thing to note here is that we are going to an 80% target rather than the 100% target. So the volumes of hydrogen produced here and the volumes of synthetic fuels produced are smaller than what we would see in a 100 by 50 study. Then we have some small amount of direct air capture. We have biofuels production. We have energy storage as well. The new sources of electric load are shown here. So electrolysis capacity, we have about 800 megawatts by 2050. We have a small amount of DAC by 2050, and electric boiler capacity is another form of flexible industrial load that is cost effective. And this is where we retain gas boilers, but we make them dual fuel. And so we can balance our loads where we have a lot of renewable energy available, then we can use that for the electric boiler component. If we don't have renewables available, then we can use gas to power those boilers, and that's an effective way of balancing loads. So getting onto exports here, this is something that in both the Washington study and the Oregon study, we've shown are really important opportunities for Montana and for the West in general to be able to take advantage of these low-cost wind resources. Electricity generation on the top there, we see the wind component being the large sector of growth in electricity and the resulting net exports on the bottom. These net exports are smaller than what we see in the Washington study and the Oregon study, because in the 2018 Northwest EDP, we didn't allow the transmission to be expanded between Montana and other places. And so this is utilizing the existing transmission network to export more clean energy to other sectors, or sorry, other states. If we were allowing that transmission to expand, and if we're going to a net zero target across the West, then we would see larger amounts of wind and a much larger export market for Montana. In fuels, we are moving to clean fuels by the time we get out to 2050. Here we have diesel fuel, jet fuel, pipeline gas. The gray is fossil fuel, so starting in 2020, we're all fossil. By the time we get out to 2045, we're making pretty significant inroads into decarbonizing diesel fuel with biofuels. And then when we get to 2050, then we are completely decarbonizing jet fuel and diesel fuel with biofuels and some power to liquids as well. Pipeline gas remains 100% fossil, and this is a finding that we see in the majority of our studies. Pipeline gas is a very cheap fuel compared to the liquid fuels. So $3 an MMBTU, $3 or $4 an MMBTU is a lot cheaper than the cost of jet fuel or the cost of diesel fuel. And so avoiding procuring a gallon of jet fuel is a lot more lucrative in terms of saving money than avoiding burning a cubic foot of pipeline gas. And so that's why we typically don't decarbonize or we decarbonize the liquid fuels before we start to decarbonize pipeline gas, just because of the economics of doing so. CO2 emissions by sector. So transportation is making up 30% of it in 2020. There's major reductions in that over time. And by the time we get to 2050, then we're offsetting some of those emissions with negative emissions from transportation sector. And that's because we have biofuels with CCS as the major component of producing those fuels in 2050. So key takeaways here. The assumptions are driving final energy demand that's falling by 35% through greater efficiency, and a lot of that's coming from electrification, and that's key to cost control in decarbonizing the energy system, because the fewer total BTUs of energy that you need to provide, the smaller the investment needed in the resources to supply that energy. So that's one way of reducing costs over time. But that results in a rise of electricity demand, and so we need to grow that electricity sector to be able to accommodate that. Montana is using its geographic strengths on the supply side in the Northwest EDP, so establishing that large wind sector and exporting it to other regions, a trend that is seen to a much greater extent in the Washington study and the Oregon study. And then we're sequestering carbon as well in saline aquifers in the production of liquid fuels from biomass. So that's offsetting emissions. There is, when thinking about sequestration, the development of what is the potential of sequestration in the Northwest is an area where we could get some more information over time. Currently in studies out there on what is the potential of sequestering carbon, we don't have any potential in Washington, for example. We only have certain formations where we've incorporated the potential just because of lack of data, And so to the extent that could be developed further, then maybe there is opportunities there for sequestering more carbon in the Northwest. Where you sequester that carbon as well, it comes down to the value of the resources in the region. And so it's kind of an interesting trade-off of, what is the value of the resources? What are the transmission opportunities? What are the characteristics of the resources? For example, you might see a lot more sequestration happening in states that have high solar resources rather than wind, because the value of gas with carbon capture is higher in an area where the renewable resources is more intermittent than perhaps in a state that has large amounts of wind. There are a lot of caveats here to what we've done, and I wrote this pretty much not to read it all through, but just as the fine print at the end of the presentation that I should be reading incredibly quickly. But really the takeaways here are that we didn't tailor this study to Montana or Montana specific interests. This is coming just from the Northwest GDP set of assumptions. And there's been a lot of changes since this study was done. So changes in costs, particularly of electric vehicles, particularly of fuels, particularly of energy conversion technologies. So those things are all going to drive different results going forward. We didn't factor in COVID-19 into the 2020 results here. And we didn't allow transmission expansion. So that is a key component to the Montana solution when thinking about these export opportunities. Can we build that transmission? If we can, how much of that transmission do we want to build? So in summary, the general takeaways of what we want to do for decarbonizing the economy fall under these 5 pillars here. And this is something that we see common to all of the decarbonization studies that we're doing. This is Northwest wide, these results here. So energy efficiency, increasing decarbonized electricity, increasing decarbonized fuels, electrification, and then some carbon capture as well. And what does this mean for Montana? So policy actions taken in the rest of the West, they have an impact on what kind of investments are made in Montana. If we don't have a market for clean energy in the rest of the West, then we will not build a large exporting wind resource in Montana. And that's really key to determining the composition of the size and the composition of the electricity sector going forward. Down to the low-cost complementary wind resource that has remained valuable across the West, across all of our studies and across the years that we've been doing these studies. Transmission expansion wasn't allowed in Northwest EDP, but we're seeing that significant expansion happening in both Washington and Oregon. And we used pretty conservative costs. So we used the NREL Reads database, and we doubled the costs that they have in their database, and still that transmission was built. And so that shows the value of this wind resource to the rest of the West. And then decarbonized fuels. So decarbonized fuels are in high demand in a decarbonized economy, because we may not be moving fast enough in terms of switching away from end-use fuel use, or there are parts of the economy which we really don't have a good alternative to fuel use right now. So aviation is the prime example of that, but other parts of the economy like international shipping, these are probably going to remain, and to some extent by the time we get out to 2040, 2050. So Montana also has this opportunity of potentially producing lower cost clean fuels and exporting those to other places in the West as well. And when you think about the opportunities to do so, limited by the constraints on potential transmission expansion, then if we can't expand transmission, that's not necessarily the end of the export opportunities. Electrolysis and subsequent fuels production is another means of exporting energy to other places that need it. So that's where I'll leave it, and I'll open up to any questions that people have and have a discussion.
Well, Jeremy, thank you very much. I think the model shows the scale of the challenge. It shows opportunities as well, and that's part of the reason we wanted to start with this. We already have a couple questions via chat, and I'll read them for you. One is from Rajesh Parwar from Los Alamos National Lab. He thanks you for sharing the results of the study and asks if you could provide some details about how you incorporated stakeholder inputs into the modeling, maybe through an example.
Sure, yeah. So both the Washington and the Oregon study were stakeholder driven. Washington, we had a long stakeholder process before doing any of the modeling. And that really shaped the scenarios that we ended up doing. So we had about a 3-month process of discussing the various interests in the state and the types of policy that might be valuable to represent those interests. And then in setting up our scenarios, we wanted to be able to provide the maximum amount of information to shed light on, whether one policy was better than another, or, not even better, because what it all comes down to in the end is that the economic component that we determine through a constrained model is one facet of policy making. And there are many competing interests that are happening in state policy making, and being able to provide that economic counterpoint to a very multifaceted process just provides that extra data that is so valuable in being able to determine the best path forward. So I have some appendix slides here. I was wondering whether I have a scenario list. Looks like I didn't include one here, but basically that was the way that we incorporated the stakeholder feedback, making sure that we had a set of scenarios that best represented the interests of the state, such that the results were going to best inform the questions that they had.
Okay, thank you. And I was going to mention to participants, you can ask questions either via the chat, or if you go to the little smiley face icon at the bottom of the screen and click on that, you can raise your hand and ask questions verbally once we call on you. We did get another question via the chat. This is from Ron Caldwell with Calumet, and he asks what impact Canadian policy will have on Montana due to our proximity for export north?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually something that in our modeling work, we don't have a detailed demand side model of Canada. And so we haven't represented the intertie with Canada into Washington. And currently that is in large part, it's relatively small, and in large part it's a hydro import that's under contract to California currently. But what might happen in the future is relatively uncertain, because if we think about Washington, Washington is currently under contract exporting hydro resources to the rest of the West, but then we are switching to being a net importer by the time Washington gets out to 2040, importing 43% of their electricity. Canada may be in a similar situation. It may be that Canada starts to import electricity as well, as their hydro resource is fixed resource, their loads grow beyond that. And Montana wind could also be valuable for exports north too. It really depends on the transmission opportunities, and also the opportunities for building out resources in Canada. And I'm not familiar with the potentials and the resource quality in British Columbia, Alberta, in terms of their wind resource, but it could well be an opportunity.
And then from Dave Morgan, he's asking if the slides are available or if there's a report of this that's available to the participants.
I'm happy to make these slides available. And this is a question for Eileen. I'm not sure whether the previous study that we did for Montana, whether that was ever a public document. Is that something we could link to?
Eileen, we couldn't really hear your answer. Maybe it was brief, so maybe you could do it via chat if. But if you're okay with us distributing the slides, we can do so.
Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay. And from Jeff Fox, does great modeling work and thanks, but he is skeptical about Montana's potential to export energy through electrolysis, especially if that export is not through pipelines. What kind of assumptions did your model make concerning the transportation costs of clean fuels via pipeline and whether it involves repurposing natural gas pipelines?
So we don't have any transportation via pipeline currently, because what's happening is the electrolysis is producing hydrogen. It's being combined with carbon locally and being produced into liquid fuels. And then liquid fuels, we're assuming that's using existing liquid fuel transportation networks to move it across the West. And we have a transportation cost associated with that from publicly available studies, but I'm not sure what that is off the top of my head right now. It's kind of an interesting question from an accounting perspective, actually, because if you think about whether you're using a clean fuel in one state, do you have to use the actual clean fuel, or can you use a clean fuel credit? And if you're using a clean fuel credit, then you could produce a clean fuel, inject it into the existing transportation networks for our liquid fuels, even for our gaseous fuels somewhere in the US, and then take that credit for the clean fuel production. If you have to use the physical fuel, then you need to take physical delivery of that. And that would have different cost implications for doing so.
Okay, and if on the chat I mispronounce anybody's name, my apologies. The next one is from John Smiley, and it is, how do investments in improving the efficiency of buildings fit into the model? Do you assume different amounts of that investment or different rates of reducing energy use?
Yes, so there's two forms of that. One is in the appliances contained within the buildings. And so for all of those, we have a stock of existing technologies. We have about 370 technologies represented in our model, and they get more efficient with newer vintages. So if somebody's replacing an older vintage with a newer vintage of the same technology, we're using the efficiency of that newer vintage. So you get some efficiency improvement there. If you're switching technologies, you're going, say, from resistance heating to heat pumps, then you're getting the efficiency gains of that different technology. At the same time, we also are applying building shell measures too. And building shell measures have an impact on the energy demands of the various appliances that are contained within the building. And so over time, we have some assumption about people's stock rollover on the building shell side too. So we're moving to more efficient buildings, and that's impacting our total energy demand.
And then just for everybody's benefit, all of this is public information, Eileen tells us, and she is sending the links to us, which we will send out. And Eileen will also be providing information about their stakeholder engagement process that we can make available. And we're very interested as the project proponents in looking at how you did the stakeholder engagement. We may have something to learn there. And then, I'm sorry, the chat window jumps when somebody adds. What role does distributed energy production play in modeling direct energy sources? That's also from John Smiley.
So we have assumptions about how much rooftop solar is being adopted over time. So that's one part of it where there is some growth associated with that sector. And then the other part of it is flexible loads and distributed energy resources. We are assuming that the various appliances that are going in, either newly electrified appliances or updated vintages of existing electric appliances, some portion of those can participate in flexible load programs. And so I believe in all of these studies, we have 50% participation of all of our electric appliances that are eligible to participate. So things that have some kind of thermal inertia or electrochemical storage, and that would be water heating, space heating, electric vehicles, air conditioning, refrigeration. These can participate based on a constraints on comfort, basically. If you can shift loads by an hour, if you can shift them by 2 hours, and 50% of all of those loads are flexible by the time we get out to 2040. So that's one part of incorporation of DERs. The other part is scenario based. So we are taking these assumptions about how much rooftop solar is going to be installed over time, because based on purely just the economics, then our model is going to choose the grid scale stuff over the distributed stuff. But one of the big advantages of distributed resources is that they can be installed relatively quickly. You don't need to go through permitting, you don't need to build new transmission, and to the extent that there are constraints or hurdles to overcome in locating so much grid scale resources so quickly. All these studies have a lot of solar being built out, a lot of wind being built in a relatively short period of time. The distributed energy resources could potentially mitigate the need for such pace in rolling out these grid scale resources. So we have scenarios in I can't remember off the top of my head what was in Northwest GDP, but we typically run scenarios where we have limited resource potentials on the grid scale side, and that impacts the amount of distributed resources that we're building.
And then moderator's privilege, I'll ask a question. In your infrastructure build out, looking at transmission, you indicated some desirable places to increase transmission. In the process of analyzing the cost of that, were you using existing right-of-ways, or were significant new right-of-ways needing to be established?
That's a great question. In these studies I presented today, we were not making any assumption about whether the right-of-way needed to be expanded or whether it was a new right-of-way. We are relying on the NREL REITs database as to their evaluation of what was needed, and then we were doubling the cost that they assumed for expansion of that particular corridor. We are in the process of of updating and moving to a more detailed representation, looking at the various types of land use and potential corridor pathways for expanding these transmission corridors. And so in future studies, we may have access to a more sophisticated representation of expanding those transmission corridors.
Okay, and then another question from Ron Caldwell, and I'll take the liberty of broadening it some. He asked if the modeling takes into account secondary impacts of reducing petroleum fuels, and he uses the specific example of asphalt roads perhaps needing to switch to concrete road building, which may have a cost difference. And I would broaden that to say, you know, there's other products from the fossil fuel area, and are those secondary impacts in the included in the modeling in any way?
Yes, so we're including all of those demands from the economy. So the demand for asphalt, the demand for other types of products. One way that those are factored in is that take the example of asphalt, we are locking up carbon in that asphalt. And so when you're looking at our emissions results, the emissions on the positive side of the axis are gross. So it includes the emissions from that asphalt carbon, but then you'll see a product and bunkering offset on the bottom, and that product component is offsetting basically that locked up part of the carbon in the asphalt. But at the moment, we are not transitioning away from asphalt, but we are significantly reducing the refining capacity over time because of the reduced demand for petroleum products. But we can easily represent a shift to cement roads or other things like that, which would have their own, you know, carbon emissions associated with them in the cement production.
If I could ask you to not share your screen, it'd make it easier for me to see if anybody's got a hand raised, because I can only see a few people at a time. I don't see any hands up. Any more questions through the chat? One thing I would comment on is it'll be very interesting to take the results of this study when we engage stakeholders. One of the big challenges in this state is, of course, the large distances for transportation fuels. And I know that you maybe are allowing some carbon emissions for over road trucking and larger scale, but mainly electrifying all the passenger vehicle fleet. And given recharge times and vast distances, I suspect that's something we'll get feedback on in the stakeholder process. Any comments on that?
Well, that is something that we had discussed last year, actually, the scenarios around electrification of the vehicle fleet. And that's something that we typically test that as a scenario in our other studies where we're doing a slower transition to electric. Maybe we need to wait for technology. Maybe it's customer uptake is not as enthusiastic. All types of reason could impact what that transition rate looks like, and larger driving distances, more vehicle miles traveled is one of those things. And so we can build that into an analysis where we're looking at scenarios specifically around that question. And that will be very influential in the types of investment and policy put in place.
We had a former senator who characterized Montana with only about 1 million people as grown now, but as a medium-sized city, but with very widely spread suburbs.
Right.
So I don't see any additional questions. I'm going to give people a minute to think and ask. I want to thank you very much. I know it was a extra duty for you to be involved because of your current travel situation. So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation that will, I think, stimulate a lot of thought. And I think we can take a few-minute break because I think the next session starts at 10:45. So thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, everyone.